Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. I'm Edward. Tell me, is there a folded paper near you tonight? An old letter? A forgotten fold in something worn thin by time? Watson once learned that even a crease can betray a secret the ink was never meant to tell. If you enjoy such quiet unravellings, do subscribe. Now look closer, for as Holmes believed, it is the small things that are infinitely the most important. Find us always on the Watson's Margins Spotify channel, link below. Chapter 1. The Prisoners of Blackthorn Hall. It was in the bitter January of the year 1892 that I accompanied my friend Sherlock Holmes upon one of the strangest and most closely reasoned investigations of his career, an affair which, for reasons that will become apparent, I have hitherto been reluctant to set before the public. The case concerned a family of ancient name, a document of doubtful origin, and a murder committed, as it seemed, within a chamber into which no living soul could have passed. I set it down now, at some distance from the events themselves, because the lesson which Holmes drew from that snow-bound house on the Yorkshire moors has remained with me longer than almost any other conclusion he ever reached. We had received, some 4 days before, a letter written in a hand at once vigorous and uncertain, the hand of a man unaccustomed to asking for help, and yet driven to it against his inclination. The letter came from Sir Reginald Ashcombe, of Blackthorn Hall, a name known to Holmes, as he informed me, through certain charitable trusts and a minor dispute over enclosure rights some years before. Sir Reginald wrote that he had received an anonymous communication touching upon the marriage of his late brother, Captain Alistair Ashcombe, and that the matter, though it might appear trivial to a stranger, threatened consequences to his family and his estate of the gravest character. He begged that Holmes would come to Blackthorn Hall with the least possible delay, and that he would say no more upon paper than he had already said. "You will observe, Watson," said Holmes, tossing the letter across to me as we sat before our fire in Baker Street, "that Sir Reginald has crossed out a sentence no fewer than 3 times before abandoning the attempt altogether. A man does not labour so painfully over a request for assistance in a matter of enclosure rights. You think there is more behind it than he has written. I think," said he, "that he has written considerably less than he knows, and that the anonymous letter he speaks of has frightened him more than he cares to confess even to himself. A baronet of 68 does not send for a consulting detective in the depth of winter over a trifle." We travelled north upon the following day, and by the time our train drew into the little station some 3 miles from Blackthorn Hall, the sky had taken on that leaden, expectant colour which any countryman will tell you precedes a heavy fall of snow. Sir Reginald's own carriage awaited us, and as we drove up through bare and shivering woods toward the hall, the first flakes began to descend, softly at first, and then with a settled purpose that boded ill for our return. Blackthorn Hall itself was a rambling structure of grey stone, added to by successive generations without much regard for symmetry, so that wings and gables jutted out at unexpected angles, and long draughty corridors connected chambers of every age and character. It stood upon a shoulder of the moor some distance from any neighbouring house, connected to the outer world by a single road and a telegraph wire that ran beside it upon leaning poles. Sir Reginald himself met us in the hall, a spare, upright man with a soldier's bearing, and a face deeply lined by weather and, I thought, by some more recent anxiety. He grasped Holmes's hand with evident relief. "You are very good to come, Mr. Holmes, and in such weather. I confess I hardly expected you before tomorrow." "The matter seemed to admit of no delay," said Holmes. "Your letter suggested as much, even where your words did not." Sir Reginald's eyes flickered, but he said only that we must first be warmed and fed, and that the household would assemble at dinner when he hoped Holmes might form his own impressions of those under his roof. It was, I thought even then, an odd manner of proceeding, to introduce a detective into a house of suspects before the nature of the suspicion had even been named. But Holmes accepted the arrangement without comment, and I understood him well enough to know that he welcomed the opportunity to observe unprepared faces. The household that assembled that evening in the long dining room beneath candles that guttered whenever the wind found some crevice in the old walls numbered 8 souls besides ourselves. There was Miss Eleanor Ashcombe, Sir Reginald's niece, a composed young woman with grave eyes, and the quiet self-possession of one who had long managed a household of men. She was, as I understood, regarded by all as the certain heir to Blackthorn Hall. There was Mr. Julian Ashcombe, a cousin of pleasant address and ready laughter, whose fine clothes sat upon him with a carelessness that suggested debt rather than indifference. There was Mrs. Lydia Mercer, a quiet widow of middle years, once companion to Sir Reginald's late sister-in-law, who spoke little but watched much. The Reverend Tobias Hale, a clergyman of comfortable figure and easy manner, sat near the solicitor, Mr. Edwin Pike, a precise, dry, obliging little man who anticipated every want of the table with the same neat efficiency he doubtless brought to his ledgers. Dr. Nathaniel Gresham, the family physician, spoke with the bluntness of his profession, though I noticed he polished his spectacles with unusual frequency, and at the foot of the table, though he did not properly belong there and took his place only at Sir Reginald's insistence, sat old Silas Reed, the steward, who had served the family, as he told me himself, for 31 years. It was, upon the surface, an evening of perfect courtesy. Wine was passed, and old family stories were told, and no one word of discord broke the smoothness of the hour. And yet I had not sat through the fish before I observed that Holmes's eyes, beneath their lowered lids, missed nothing. It was he who remarked afterward, as we stood together in the library while the storm rattled the casements, that Mr. Pike's boots, drying by the fire, bore the unmistakable dampness of recent wear, though the solicitor had declared with some emphasis that he had not stirred from the library the entire evening. "A small matter," said I. "Every matter is small," said Holmes, "until it is not." I observed also that Mrs. Mercer's eyes went at once to Mr. Pike, whenever Captain Ashcombe's name was spoken, as though she expected some word from him rather than from Sir Reginald. "And did you remark the Reverend Hale's ring?" I confessed I had not. "A clerical ring bearing the crest of Marsden parish. He mentioned at dinner that he had left that living some 15 years since. Men do not commonly continue to wear the seal of an office they have long abandoned, Watson, unless that seal retains some present use to them." I should have pressed him further, but at that moment Sir Reginald himself entered, his face grave, and behind him the wind rose to such a pitch that the great door groaned upon its hinges. He came to tell us, in a voice carefully controlled, that the telegraph wire had gone dead an hour since, and that Reed reported the road already impassable beyond the second gate. "We're cut off then," said Holmes quietly. "I fear so, Mr. Holmes. Cut off, all of us, until the storm shall choose to release us." He said it lightly enough, and yet I saw his hand tremble upon the door-frame, and I understood, though I could not then have said why, that Sir Reginald Ashcombe feared something a great deal nearer to him than the snow. "You spoke in your letter of your brother's marriage," Holmes said. "Will you not tell me now what has occurred?" But Sir Reginald only shook his head, murmured that the hour was late and the matter better discussed by daylight, and left us to the howling of the wind and to such conjectures as we could form alone. Chapter 2. A Certificate from the Dead. Morning brought no relief from the storm, only a paler light by which to observe its violence. I woke to find the windows of my chamber crusted with frost upon the inside, and when I descended I found the household already astir, though astir in a manner more subdued than the previous evening's courtesies had promised. Sir Reginald met us at the foot of the stair. He had not slept, I think. There was a greyness beneath his eyes that no fire could warm away. "Mr. Holmes," said he without preamble, "I must show you something. I had hoped to spare myself the necessity, but I see now that concealment serves no one." He led us through a passage I had not before traversed, narrow and cold, to a low iron-bound door at its end. Within was a chamber lined with deed-boxes and shelves of parchment, the family archive, as he named it, where 3 centuries of the Ashcombe's business had accumulated in dust and leather. He drew a key from his waistcoat, unlocked one of the boxes, and lifted from it a single sheet, yellowed and creased, which he laid upon the table beneath the window, with the reluctance of a man handling something venomous. "This was found yesterday morning," he said, "sealed within that box beneath papers that had lain undisturbed, so far as I know, for 26 years. Read it, and you will understand why I sent for you." I read over Holmes's shoulder. It was a certificate of marriage, dated the 14th of June in the year 1866, joining in matrimony one Captain Alistair Ashcombe and a woman named Clara Vale. The signatures of both parties appeared at the foot, together with that of a clergyman styling himself the Reverend Tobias Hale, officiating, and 2 further names as witnesses. A parish seal, faint but legible, was stamped beside the whole. "Your brother," said Holmes, "my elder brother, Mr. Holmes, dead these 20 years, who who I believed all his life had never married. Clara Vale was governess here in this house, until some scandal, the nature of which was never fully explained to me, drove her away. I understood her to have left England. I never dreamed—" He broke off and pressed his hand to the table's edge as though to steady himself. "If this paper is genuine, then Clara Vale's surviving child, should one exist, stands before my niece in the succession to this house." "You have shown this to your solicitor?" "Mr. Pike examined it within the hour of its discovery. He tells me that until its authenticity is disproved, I dare not alter my will, nor confirm Eleanor's position, nor indeed do anything but wait." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Mr. Pike appeared at that moment in the doorway, his manner as neat and composed as his dress, and confirmed in a few dry sentences the very difficulty Sir Reginald had described. The law, he observed, was a patient instrument, but an unforgiving one. Until the document was proved false, no court would permit its claims to be simply disregarded. It was some little while later that the Reverend Hale was brought to the archive, summoned by Sir Reginald to account for the signature that bore his name. I had expected bluster, or perhaps a flat denial. Instead, the clergyman's broad face had gone the colour of tallow, and his hands, when he took up the certificate, shook visibly. "I remember it," he said at last in a voice scarcely above a whisper. "God forgive me. I remember performing that ceremony. Captain Ashcombe came to me privately and begged that the matter be kept from his family. He said his father would never countenance the match, and that disgrace would follow discovery. I was younger then, and perhaps too willing to oblige a gentleman of his standing." "You performed a secret marriage," said Holmes, "and told no one for 26 years?" "What was I to do, Mr. Holmes? The captain is long dead. I judge the secret buried with him." Holmes said nothing further to this, but I observed that his eyes had scarcely left the document since it was laid upon the table, and that he now asked leave to examine it beneath the lamp that stood in the corner. Sir Reginald granted the request with a kind of weary indifference, as though one more indignity could scarcely matter now. I watched my friend bend over the paper with the lens he always carried, turning it first to catch the light upon its surface, then holding it near the flame to study, as I supposed, the texture of the fibres. He ran his finger along the fold, held the sheet at an angle to observe the pattern of the ink, and finally examined, with a care that seemed disproportionate to its object, the dust that lay thick upon the shelf from which the deed-box had been taken. "A curious thing," he said at length, straightening. "Tell me, Sir Reginald, who last wound the long case clock that stands in the eastern corridor?" The question fell into the room like a stone into still water. Sir Reginald stared at him. "The clock, Mr. Holmes? I could not say. Reed attends to it, I believe, as he attends to all such things. What possible bearing—" "Perhaps none whatever," said Holmes pleasantly, and would say no more, though I saw Mr. Pike's brow contract for the briefest instant before his features resumed their habitual smoothness. I confess that I, no less than the rest of the company, took this for one of those eccentricities with which Holmes sometimes tested the patience of those around him. It was only afterward, when we had withdrawn to our own rooms, that he spoke of the matter again. "You thought my question idle, Watson. I will own that I did. And yet a man who insists upon precision in every other particular of his story generally has some particular reason for allowing one detail to remain vague. I do not yet know why the household sense of time should serve anyone's purpose, but I am now persuaded that it does. As for the certificate itself," he paused, frowning at the fire, "I doubt not merely its contents, Watson, but the very manner of its discovery." He would say no more that night, and indeed the wind soon rose to such a fury that further conversation became difficult. The snow, already deep, continued to fall against the lower windows until they were half buried in white, and somewhere beyond my chamber door in the small hours I heard, or thought I heard, a soft and deliberate footstep passing along the archive passage. Chapter 3. Death Behind a Bolted Door. I was roused before 7 by a hammering upon my door and the voice of Silas Reed, cracked with an urgency I had not before heard in him, calling that Sir Reginald could not be wakened, and that the archive door stood fast against all efforts to open it. Holmes was already in the corridor when I emerged, fully dressed, as though he had not troubled to sleep at all. Together we hastened to the passage where, the previous night, I had fancied I heard a footstep, and found there a small knot of the household gathered before the iron-bound door, Mr. Pike foremost among them, his knuckles white upon the handle. "It is bolted from within, Mr. Holmes," said he. "I can hear no answer, though I have called Sir Reginald's name a dozen times." "Then we must force it," said Holmes. and it was he and Dr. Gresham together, with Reed's shoulder added to theirs, who at length drove the old door from its socket. The scene within has remained with me, I think, more vividly than almost any other in the whole course of my association with Holmes. Sir Reginald lay upon the floor near the table, one arm flung out, his face the colour of wood ash. A lamp lay overturned beside him, its oil spread in a dark stain across the boards. A brandy glass, shattered, lay some feet distant beneath the leg of a heavy chair, and upon the table itself rested the marriage certificate, its edges scorched and blackened as though flame had been set to it, and then, for some reason, withdrawn. Dr. Gresham was upon his knees beside the stricken man in an instant, and for a moment I thought we had come too late for even the barest word. But Sir Reginald's eyes opened, wandered a moment without recognition, and then fixed themselves, with a terrible effort of will, upon Holmes's face. "The witness," he whispered. "Ask the second witness." The sentence broke off. His head fell back, and though Gresham worked over him with the whole of his skill, it was plain within a very few minutes that Sir Reginald Ashcombe had spoken his last words in this world. There followed a silence broken only by the wind, until Gresham rose, wiping his hands upon a cloth, and pronounced, in the flat voice of a man delivering an opinion he does not wholly relish, that the heart had failed, very possibly under the shock of the fire and the fumes it had raised. "There is a smell of some medicinal preparation in the room," Holmes observed. "A residue only," said Gresham, a shade too quickly, I thought, and busied himself with his bag. It was perhaps 3/4 of an hour later that Inspector Bradstreet arrived, having reached the hall the previous afternoon upon some other business and been overtaken, like ourselves, by the storm before he could depart. He was a solid, capable officer, whom Holmes had encountered before, and he set about the room with the brisk thoroughness of long habit. "A plain enough matter on the face of it," said he, when he had heard the circumstances. "The old gentleman came down in the night, meaning to burn the certificate himself rather than let the scandal come to light. Grief does strange things to a man's judgment. The lamp went over in the struggle with his own conscience, so to speak, and the shock of it, together with the smoke, was too much for his heart. The bolted door speaks for itself, Mr. Holmes. No one else could have been within." "No one else could have left, certainly," said Holmes. "That is a somewhat different proposition. Might I trouble you for a few minutes before your theory hardens into certainty?" Bradstreet, with the good-humoured tolerance he generally extended to my friend's methods, gave his consent, and Holmes moved about the chamber with a deliberation that seemed to my eye almost unbearably slow, given the gravity of the hour. "Consider the lamp," said he at last, crouching beside the stain it had left. "It lies here, some 3 feet from where Sir Reginald fell, its base toward the door, yet observe the spread of the oil. It runs not toward the door where the lamp's mouth is turned, but toward the fireplace, against the very lie of the vessel. A lamp falling as this one fell would stain the boards behind it, not before. The table might have been jostled," Bradstreet suggested without great conviction. "The table stands precisely as it always has, if the dust upon its legs is any guide. Now the glass." Holmes lifted with great care the chair whose leg lay across the shattered fragments. "You will observe that this chair has left an unbroken ring of dust upon the floor beneath each foot, undisturbed these several days, and yet the broken glass lies beneath it, as though the glass fell and broke, and only afterward the chair was set down upon the pieces. A man does not commonly rearrange his furniture in the act of dying, Inspector." He crossed then to the window, examining first the outer sill, thick with unbroken snow, and then the inner latch, upon which a fine rime of frost had gathered during the night. "The window has not been opened from without. The snow is a perfect and unmarked crust. But see here, upon the latch itself, where the frost has been disturbed by a hand, and quite recently, for the marks have not yet reformed." He turned next to the bolt of the door itself, holding his lens close against the metal. "And here, Watson, a smear of beeswax, fresh enough still to take a fingerprint, upon a bolt that by rights should show nothing but the plain wear of iron on iron." Bradstreet's confidence, I observed, had begun to waver, though he said nothing. "One thing more." Holmes knelt beside the body, drew back the sleeve of the dead man's right arm, and showed us the flesh singed faintly beneath the cloth. The lamp, by every account, stood to his left hand, yet the burn is upon his right sleeve, and the certificate itself. He lifted it gently from the table. "You will note that the flame has taken only the margins. The centre of the page, where the signatures stand, is untouched, as though whoever set the fire took the greatest pains that it should burn just enough to seem an attempt at destruction, and no more. "You're suggesting, Mr. Holmes," said Bradstreet slowly, "that this was no accident." "I am suggesting," said Holmes, "that someone wished us to believe it was, and took considerable trouble over the belief. Whether that same person also wished Sir Reginald dead is a question we have not yet earned the right to answer." Chapter 4. The Footprints in the Snow. The snow had ceased falling by mid-morning, though the sky remained the colour of pewter, and it was in that grudging light that one of the maids, sent out to fetch wood from the store beside the eastern wing, came running back with the news that footprints led away from the terrace toward the old chapel. Bradstreet was upon them within minutes, and I confess my own pulse quickened as we followed him out into the bitter air. The prints were plain enough, a single trail pressed deep into the crust of snow, leading from the flagstones of the terrace across the open ground toward the ivy-grown chapel that stood, disused these many years, at the farthest edge of the grounds. Some yards short of its door the trail vanished beneath a fresh drift, as though the wind in the last hour of the storm had drawn a curtain across whatever had passed that way. Near the chapel porch, half buried, Bradstreet's sergeant turned up a single glove of dark leather, which Reed, upon being shown it, identified without hesitation as belonging to Mr. Julian Ashcombe. That gentleman, summoned to account for it, offered at first a careless denial, then, under Bradstreet's steady questioning, admitted with evident reluctance that he had indeed gone out during the night. "I was meeting no one," he said, though his colour betrayed him even as he spoke the words. "I merely wished for air. A man cannot always sleep, Inspector, under a roof where his uncle lies dying above stairs." It was not, I thought, a performance calculated to win confidence, and Bradstreet plainly thought the same. Julian's circumstances, moreover, spoke against him with an eloquence he could not silence. It was generally known throughout the house that he stood deeply in debt, that he had quarrelled with Sir Reginald not a fortnight since over an advance refused him, and that should Eleanor's claim to the estate be overthrown by the newly discovered marriage, a portion of what remained might well fall to him. Within the chapel itself, Bradstreet made a further discovery that seemed, upon its surface, to close the case as neatly as a book. Among the dust of the old vestry he found several scraps of paper, crumpled and thrust behind a loose stone, bearing repeated and increasingly confident attempts at the signature Reginald Ashcombe. "There is your forger, Mr. Holmes," said he, not without satisfaction, "and there, I think, is very nearly your whole case. A young man in debt practising another man's signature in a deserted chapel, his glove left at the very door." Holmes took the scraps of paper without comment and studied them a long while beneath the grey light of the vestry window. "You will observe, Inspector, that these attempts are written in a violet ink, of a particular shade I have seen nowhere in this house, save upon the desk in the estate office, where I noticed it yesterday among Mr. Pike's effects. Mr. Julian, unless I'm much mistaken, favours a plain black ink, and writes, moreover, with his left hand." He held up the paper. "These signatures were formed by a right hand, as the slant and pressure plainly show." Bradstreet's face fell a little, but he was not a man to abandon a theory merely because one plank of it had given way. "The glove remains, Mr. Holmes." "The glove remains," Holmes agreed, and stooping drew it from the inspector's hand to examine the lining. "And is, you will find, perfectly dry within, though it has lain, upon your own account, in snow for the better part of the night. A glove so exposed does not remain dry, Inspector, whatever its owner's guilt or innocence." He turned next to the footprints themselves, walking the length of the trail with his lens close to the snow, pausing here and there to measure the depth of an impression with a slender rule he carried for such purposes. "A curious gait," he murmured. "The prints show precisely the same depth, whether the foot fell upon packed snow near the terrace or upon the soft drift nearer the chapel. A walking man's weight varies with his stride and with the yielding of the ground beneath him. These do not vary at all. I begin to suspect, Watson, that we are looking not at the trace of a man walking, but at the mark of a weighted boot, pressed rather than worn." It was while we stood considering this singular fact that Holmes's attention was drawn to the chapel's old parish register, which lay, half forgotten, upon a shelf beneath the vestry window. He turned its brittle pages with great care, and stopped at length upon a place where a single leaf had been cut cleanly away, close against the binding. The Reverend Hale, questioned upon the point, coloured deeply and explained with more haste than conviction that the missing page had been damaged by damp some years before and removed to prevent the corruption of its neighbours. "A pity," said Holmes mildly, "that so careful a preservation should have left no trace of mildew upon the pages that remain." Hale made no answer to this, and Holmes did not press him further, though I saw his eyes rest upon the clergyman's ring a moment longer than courtesy required. It was that evening, as we sat apart from the rest of the household, that I confessed to Holmes my growing conviction that Hale himself lay at the root of the matter. "He has lied to us twice already," said I, "once concerning the marriage he now half denies performing, and once concerning that missing page, and I have this day learned from Reed that Hale received money from Captain Ashcombe some years before the captain's death, money that was never explained." "All of which may be true," said Holmes, "and none of which brings us appreciably nearer to a murderer. A man may be a liar, Watson, and even a rogue in some small matter of finance, without possessing either the opportunity or the design to bolt a door from without, and leave a dying man behind it. I confess the evidence against Mr. Julian, and now against the Reverend Hale, troubles me a good deal more than it satisfies me." "How so?" "Because it has been laid before us with such obliging completeness, a glove precisely where a glove should be, signatures precisely where signatures should be found, though written by the wrong hand, a missing page, explained by a lie so thin that a child might see through it. I have long held, Watson, that the truth is rarely so accommodating to the men who seek it. When evidence offers itself with such eagerness, I begin to suspect that it has been sent to meet me." Chapter 5. What the Eyes Betray. Holmes proposed, upon the following morning, that he should see each member of the household separately, and Bradstreet, having by now abandoned any pretence of managing the inquiry himself, readily agreed. We took the small morning room for the purpose, a chamber whose single virtue, Holmes remarked, was a window placed so that the light fell full upon whoever sat opposite him, while leaving his own face in comparative shadow. I noticed, as the interviews proceeded, how little Holmes troubled himself with direct questions, and how much with the manner of their answering, the set of a shoulder, the interval before a reply, the small betrayals of hand and eye that a man cannot govern so easily as his tongue. Julian Ashcombe was the first brought before him, and appeared, I thought, almost relieved to unburden himself. "I will tell you the truth, Mr. Holmes, since lying has served me so poorly thus far. I went to the chapel to meet Mrs. Mercer. She had sent word that she wished to speak with me privately concerning my uncle Alistair, and I confess I hoped she meant to speak of the marriage, whether it were genuine or false. I said nothing of the meeting because I knew how it must look, myself already suspected of forging that wretched certificate. And did the lady come? I waited the better part of an hour. She never appeared. Mrs. Mercer, called in her turn, confirmed the appointment with a composure that seemed to cost her some effort. "I intended to go," she said. "I had learned something, Mr. Holmes, that I believed Mr. Julian ought to know before matters went further. But my door was found fastened when I came to leave my room, fastened from without, I am persuaded, for I could not stir it, though I turned the handle a dozen times. I supposed at length that some servant had mistaken the lock and gave up the attempt." Holmes said nothing to this for a moment, then leaned forward and, with a courtesy that did not conceal the sharpness of his interest, asked whether she would permit him to examine the hem of her gown, which lay across a chair where she had set aside her outdoor cloak the day before. She consented, plainly bewildered, and Holmes drew from the dark wool a small splinter of varnished wood, which he held a long while to the light. "A trifle," said he, "but a trifle of the same varnish, I think, as the pews of the chapel yonder. You were nearer that building, Mrs. Mercer, than a locked door would seem to allow." She grew pale, but persisted that she had never passed beyond the terrace, and Holmes, though I saw he did not fully credit her, pressed the point no further. The Reverend Hale came next and repeated, almost word for word, the account he had given us before, that he had performed the secret marriage of Captain Ashcombe and Clara Vale, 26 years since, at the captain's own urgent and private request. "Then perhaps," said Holmes, "you would be so good as to show me how the parties stood before you at the altar. You, I take it, faced the congregation. The groom would stand upon your right hand, according to custom, and the bride upon your left." Hale hesitated, then arranged an imaginary company with his hands, and in doing so placed the bride upon the wrong side entirely, correcting himself only when Holmes's silence made the error apparent even to him. "A slip of the memory," he stammered. 26 years is a long while, Mr. Holmes." "It is," said Holmes gently, and yet a man does not commonly forget upon which hand he gave a bride away, however distant the year. Dr. Gresham, when his turn came, maintained stoutly that Sir Reginald's death was natural, the heart failing under strain as hearts will, and grew impatient when Holmes returned again to the medicinal odour that had hung about the archive. "I attended the old gentleman for a chill not 3 days before," said he, and fell as he spoke to polishing his spectacles with a vigour quite out of proportion to their cleanliness, a habit I now observed that recurred each time the subject of that smell arose, as though his hands required some occupation his conscience could not otherwise supply. Mr. Pike proved, of all the household, the readiest with his answers. He furnished times and movements for every person under that roof with a precision that might have done credit to a railway timetable, and yet Holmes remarked afterward that the solicitor had glanced no fewer than 4 times toward the clock in the eastern corridor before offering each estimate, a clock which, as we later learned, had in fact stopped during the night, and could have told him nothing whatsoever. Silas Reed, last of all, said little, as was his habit, save that the household clocks had all agreed at 11 the night Sir Reginald died. Holmes, consulting his own watch against the timepiece in the hall, discovered that the archive clock in particular ran some 12 minutes slow, a discrepancy Reed himself seemed wholly unaware of. When the last of them had gone, Holmes sat a long while in silence, his fingers steepled before him. "What do you make of it, Watson?" "That half the household is lying to us," said I, "though I cannot say to what common purpose." "There is no common purpose," said Holmes. "That is precisely what has misled us. Mrs. Mercer conceals one thing, Hale another, Gresham a third, each for reasons entirely his own, and their several falsehoods have knit themselves together, quite by accident, into the appearance of a conspiracy. It is a fortunate murderer, Watson, who finds himself surrounded by liars, for every lie he did not tell serves as well as one he did, to draw suspicion away from the truth. Then who— I don't yet know who bolted that door," said Holmes, "but I begin to know why every clock in this house has told us a different hour, and I promise you that discrepancy will hang the guilty man as surely as any confession." Chapter 6. The Silent Agreement. "There is a difference, Watson," said Holmes, as we walked the length of the long gallery that afternoon, our footsteps sounding hollow upon the boards, between a witness who lies to protect himself and a witness who lies to protect another. The first sort commonly betrays himself through carelessness, the second through a consistency too perfect to be natural. I mean now to discover which sort of liar we are dealing with in each case, and I think you will find the household more forthcoming than it has yet appeared, provided one asks not what happened, but what each person feared would be thought of them. His method proved itself before the day was out. Mrs. Mercer, taken alone once more and pressed gently but persistently upon the matter of her intended meeting with Julian, at length abandoned her reserve. "I meant to tell him of Clara Vale," she said. "I was companion to his late aunt in those years, Mr. Holmes, and I know things that were never spoken of openly in this house. Clara did not simply vanish after her disgrace. She bore a child some months after leaving Blackthorn Hall. Of that I am certain, for I had it from her own letter, written to me in confidence. I believed the child had died in its infancy. I am no longer certain even of that. And you kept this from Sir Reginald." "I kept it from everyone," said she, "until I saw that certificate and understood that old secrets had begun, of their own accord, to walk abroad." The Reverend Hale, confronted privately and without the presence of the inspector, whose uniform seemed to loosen no man's tongue, made a confession of his own, delivered with the particular misery of a man long accustomed to concealment. "I never married them, Mr. Holmes. There was no ceremony. But years ago I accepted a sum of money, I will not pretend otherwise, to enter a false memorandum in an old parish record, suggesting that some understanding existed between the captain and Miss Vale. I did not then know to what use it might be put. I have maintained the lie these many years because to admit it now would ruin me entirely, and because I believed, God help me, that the truth could harm no one still living." Dr. Gresham's confession followed, wrung from him by Holmes's quiet but unrelenting insistence upon the smell that had lingered in the archive. "I gave Sir Reginald a sedative in his brandy that evening," he admitted at last. His bluff manner quite deserted him. "A mild preparation only to calm his nerves, which had been sorely tried by the discovery of that certificate. I did not record the dose in my book, for I feared it might be thought I had exceeded my proper judgment in prescribing without his express request. It was not fatal, Mr. Holmes. I would stake my professional honour upon that. Julian and Mrs. Mercer, when Holmes brought them together and laid before them the plain fact that each had half confirmed the other's account, ceased at last to dissemble, and admitted between them the whole of their silent arrangement, that they had agreed, without a word of explicit compact, each to say as little as possible of the other's movements that night, from a mutual and quite unfounded fear of appearing complicit in whatever ill had befallen Sir Reginald. "You perceive the pattern now, Watson," said Holmes when we were alone once more. 4 separate secrets, 4 separate fears, and not one of them murder. Mrs. Mercer feared old gossip revived. Hale feared exposure of an ancient fraud committed for money. Gresham feared a charge of professional negligence. Julian and Mrs. Mercer feared nothing more than the appearance of an indiscretion. Someone in this house has understood, better than any of them understood themselves, how readily such fears may be woven into a rope strong enough to hang an innocent man. It was that evening that Holmes turned his full attention once more to the certificate itself, spreading it upon the table of the small morning-room with a fresh candle drawn close. "The parish seal is genuine," said he after long study. "I am now persuaded of that much, an old die, correctly formed, correctly struck. But look here, Watson, where the wax has been pressed. Beneath the impression, very faint, there runs a thin, even ridge, such as modern adhesive leaves when a seal is affixed rather than struck directly upon the page. The seal is old, its manner of application is not." He held the paper then to the candle's edge, tilting it this way and that until the fibres caught the light. "The paper itself is old beyond question, but observe the fold. A document stored 26 years in a deed box takes its fold from the box that holds it, and settles into a permanent crease. This sheet's fold does not match the depth of that box in the least particular. I think, Watson, that this paper was cut from the blank rear leaf of some other and genuinely ancient family document, and folded only recently to counterfeit an age it does not truly possess." He rang for Reed, and asked, in a manner so casual that the old steward seemed to take no alarm from it, whether he might see the ledger in which access to the archive was recorded, a formality, Holmes explained, required by his own methodical habits. Reed brought the book without demur, and Holmes turned its pages beneath the lamp, tracing each entry with his finger until he came to a place where a single line had been scraped away with some sharp instrument, so cleanly that only a careful eye and a strong light held obliquely across the page could detect that anything had ever stood there at all. He held the candle low, turning the paper until the faint indentation left by the vanished ink caught a shadow of its own. "Here," said he quietly, and I bent to look. Beneath the scraping, ghostly but unmistakable, the pressure of a pen had left its trace upon the page below. "Edwin Pike," Holmes read aloud, and looked up at me with an expression I had seen before, upon the eve of some conclusion he had not yet permitted himself to speak in full. "The most obliging man in this house, Watson, and the only one who has told us nothing whatever that required correction." Chapter 7. The Confession in the Chapel. Holmes had resolved, upon the strength of that erased name, to seek out Mr. Pike before the household retired for the night. But the solicitor was nowhere to be found, and it was not he, but the Reverend Hale, whose absence presently threw the house into fresh alarm. A search was got up within the hour, and it was Reed who at length discovered him, kneeling in the cold darkness of the abandoned chapel, a single candle guttering beside him upon the altar rail, and a written paper clutched in his hand. He did not resist when we came upon him, nor even seem greatly surprised, but rose stiffly and held the paper out Bradstreet with the air of a man surrendering something he had long carried at great cost. It was a confession, written in Hale's own hand, or so it appeared at first glance, in which he declared that he had forged the marriage certificate to conceal his earlier fraud upon the parish register, and that when Sir Reginald had confronted him with the threat of exposure, he had, in a moment of terror he could neither explain nor excuse, gone to the archive and done murder to preserve his good name. Bradstreet read it through twice, and I saw the tension go out of his shoulders as a man's will when a long and stubborn weight is at last set down. "Well," said he, "there is an end of it then. He knew the parish seal, had access enough to old records through his office, and has already confessed to lying about the marriage itself. It hangs together, Mr. Holmes, as neatly as I could wish. A small bottle, half empty, was found in the pocket of Hale's coat, and proved, upon Gresham's hurried examination, to contain a sedative preparation not unlike that which the doctor himself had earlier confessed to administering. Hale, when questioned, admitted the confession was his, in a voice so broken and exhausted that I could not, in that moment, disbelieve him. He said that no one had assisted him, that the whole dreadful business had been his alone from beginning to end. I will own that I found the explanation, taken altogether, a convincing one. Shame, old fraud, sudden terror and murder seemed to me to form as complete and melancholy a chain as any I had encountered in Holmes's company, and I said as much to him as we withdrew from the chapel. It has the shape of completeness, Holmes agreed, though something in his tone gave me pause, which is not always the same thing as the substance of it. He did not challenge Bradstreet's conclusion aloud, nor did he move to contradict Hale's own broken admission, but before the clergyman was led away under guard, Holmes asked him a single question, delivered so mildly that Bradstreet scarcely seemed to remark it. "Tell me, Mr. Hale, did you write this confession before you came to the chapel or after?" Hale stared at him, as though the question itself were beyond his comprehension in his present state, and murmured only that he could no longer be certain, that the hours since Sir Reginald's death had run together in his mind like water. "The distinction can scarcely signify, Mr. Holmes," said Bradstreet a shade impatiently. "The confession is the confession, wherever it was penned." "Perhaps," said Holmes, and said no more upon the point that night, though I observed him afterwards standing a long while beside the guttering candle upon the altar rail, turning his lens first upon the wet ink of the confession itself, and then upon the cuffs of Hale's coat, which showed even to my own eye a faint smudge of the same blue-black hue. He knelt at last beside the rail and studied, with an attention that seemed disproportionate even for him, a small rectangular patch in the dust of the stone floor beneath it, where something of a size and shape he did not name had evidently rested until quite recently. He said nothing further, and permitted Hale to be led away without protest, offering not a word in his defence before the household, though I marked that his silence sat upon him with an evident discomfort, as a garment too tight for its wearer. It was that evening, when we had withdrawn once more to the privacy of our own quarters, that I taxed him with what I could not help regarding as a want of charity. "You allowed that unhappy man to be taken away, Holmes, without so much as a word in his favour, when I know you well enough to believe you doubt his guilt. It is not like you to let an obviously broken creature bear the whole weight of another man's sin." Holmes was a long while answering, seated before the fire with his fingers steepled and his eyes fixed upon some point beyond the flames. "The man is guilty of cowardice, Watson," he said at last, "guilty of falsehood, and very probably of clerical fraud besides. Those are real offences, and he must answer for them in their own time. But they do not grant him the physical power to perform the impossible. Consider, Hale is a man of comfortable and settled habits, unused to violence, whose hands, when I examined them tonight, bore neither bruise nor strain such as a struggle with a man twice his years, however feeble, must certainly have left. Consider further that a bolt sealed from without, by means I have not yet fully proven, but partly divined, required a steadiness of nerve and a precision of method that terror does not commonly bestow upon the guilty conscience. I do not say Hale is innocent of everything. I say only that his confession answers Bradstreet's convenience a great deal better than it answers the facts, and I do not intend to let a convenient answer stand in the place of a true one, merely because the hour is late and the house is cold." "Then why did you not say so before them all?" "Because," said Holmes, rising at last and moving to the window where the last of the snow clouds were breaking apart to show a hard, cold scattering of stars, "the true author of that confession believes at this moment that his device has succeeded, and a man who believes himself safe, Watson, is very much more likely to make the one mistake that a man who knows himself watched would never permit himself to make." Chapter 8. The Clock That Never Struck. Morning brought what seemed at first a further and welcome confirmation of Hale's guilt. Silas Reed came to us early, bearing an old letter which he said had lain these many years among the late Mrs. Ashcombe's effects, and which he had only now thought to bring forward, in the confused belief that it might assist the inspector's inquiry. The letter was from Clara Vale herself, addressed to no one that the salutation named, and begged, in terms of some anguish, that the recipient would preserve the truth of the marriage, whatever injury it might bring upon those concerned. The hand, so far as I could judge, bore a marked resemblance to the bride's signature upon the certificate itself. Bradstreet received it with the satisfaction of a man to whom the world has at last consented to behave reasonably. "There is your last word upon the matter, Mr. Holmes. The lady herself confirms what poor Hale has confessed. I think we may call the case closed." "I think," said Holmes, "that we may call it very nearly closed, though not in quite the manner you suppose. Watson, will you do me the kindness of stepping with me to the eastern corridor? I have a fancy to hear that long case clock wound." We found Reed, at Holmes's request, willing enough to perform the office, and the old steward set the mechanism going with the key that hung, as it had always hung, upon its accustomed hook. The wheels turned, the pendulum took up its steady beat, but when the hands crept round to mark the half-hour, no chime sounded, though we all three stood listening for it in a silence that grew, by degrees, distinctly uncomfortable. "The bell is not struck these 6 months, sir," Reed admitted at last. "The mechanism was damaged, and Sir Reginald never troubled to have it mended. It seemed a small matter." "It is, I think, the largest matter in this whole affair," said Holmes, and I saw in his face that quiet, contained satisfaction which told me, better than any words, that some piece long missing had at last dropped into its place. He produced from his pocket-book the confession taken from Hale in the chapel, and read aloud, in a voice pitched for Bradstreet's benefit as much as my own, the sentence in which the clergyman declared that he had gone to the archive after hearing the eastern clock strike midnight. He could not have heard it, Inspector, for the plain reason that it has not struck at all these 6 months, a fact known, I should imagine, to scarcely more than 2 or 3 persons beneath this roof. A man confessing his own crime, in his own words, does not commonly invent so precise and so demonstrably false a detail. It is the sort of touch that occurs only to one who wishes to lend an account the appearance of circumstance, without troubling to verify the circumstance itself. Bradstreet's face, which had worn so comfortable an expression but a moment before, clouded visibly. "You are suggesting the confession was dictated to him." "I am suggesting a great deal more than that, and I believe I can now show it to you." Holmes turned the paper to the light. "Observe the texture of this sheet, and the fine blue sand worked into its surface where the ink has been blotted. Not common sand, Inspector, but a particular preparation I have seen nowhere in this house save upon the desk in the estate office, where Mr. Pike blots his legal correspondence. I do not think this confession was written in the chapel at all. I think it was written at that desk and carried afterward to the altar rail, where a rectangular patch in the dust beneath told me 2 nights since that some flat object, a writing board, or a book to serve as one, had lately rested and been removed. And the bottle found in his pocket bears no mark of his own fingers upon the glass, Inspector, though it bore, I noted at the time, a faint and partial print of another hand entirely, since smudged past any certain identification, but sufficient to persuade me that the bottle was placed upon his person by someone other than himself, very possibly while he sat confused or drugged, or simply too frightened to resist a familiar and trusted voice telling him what must be done to save what remained of his good name. I confessed myself now thoroughly lost among these discoveries, and said so. "And the letter Reed has brought us," Holmes continued, taking up Clara Vale's old and faded page, "is genuine, I do not doubt, so far as its greater part goes. The hand is unmistakably hers, and the paper old beyond any counterfeiting. But look here, where the single sentence concerning the marriage stands. The ink, though matched with some care to the rest, carries a faint bluish cast under this lens that the remainder of the letter does not show. This sentence has been added, Watson, and recently, by a hand with access enough to the family's old papers to select a document whose general character would lend the forgery credibility and skill enough with a pen to imitate a dead woman's hand in one particular line, having studied it at leisure among the very archives he was trusted to keep in order." "Pike," said I. "Pike," Holmes agreed, "who has had the free run of this family's papers for years past, who possesses a right hand practised in every manner of legal penmanship, and who alone among this household has told us nothing whatsoever that required correction, because he took the precaution of arranging beforehand precisely what should be found and by whom." Bradstreet, to his credit, did not waste further breath in argument, but asked at once what step Holmes proposed. "Not his arrest tonight," said Holmes, to my considerable surprise. "I think, Inspector, we shall instead observe that the snow is clearing, that a messenger may very possibly win through to the railway station by morning, and that the certificate itself, forged or genuine, will accordingly be sent to London at first light for examination by the finest document experts in England." He said this at dinner, before the whole assembled household, in a tone of the most ordinary and unguarded satisfaction, as though the matter were already as good as settled by Hale's confession, and required only this last formality to close it beyond all appeal. I saw Mr. Pike's spoon pause for the barest instant above his soup, before resuming its steady, unhurried course. "It is bait, Watson," Holmes murmured to me afterward when we had withdrawn, "and I think before this night is out we shall learn whether our fish is hungry enough to rise to it." Chapter 9. The Reconstruction at Midnight. At Holmes's request, Bradstreet gathered the household in the archive itself at the stroke of midnight, a summons that fell upon that already weary company like one more burden scarcely to be borne. Eleanor sat pale and composed beside Julian. Mrs. Mercer kept close to the door as though she wished to be first from the room should the need arise. Gresham stood with his arms folded and his spectacles for once quite still upon his nose. Mr. Pike alone appeared entirely at his ease, seated near the table with the mild, attentive expression of a solicitor awaiting the reading of a will. "I have asked you here," Holmes began, "because a murder was done in this room, behind a bolted door, and because I believe the manner of its doing will interest you a good deal more than any confession yet offered." He turned, without preamble, upon Mr. Pike. "You had learned, I think, some weeks before our arrival, that Sir Reginald intended to remove you from your office. He had discovered irregularities in the family trusts, withdrawals you could not satisfactorily account for, and your ruin, and very possibly your prosecution, stood before you as a certainty rather than a fear." Pike's face did not change, save that his eyes grew, if anything, more attentive. "To avert that ruin," Holmes continued, "you conceived a scheme of some ingenuity. If the succession to Blackthorn Hall could be thrown into sufficient doubt, litigation must follow, and litigation, Mr. Pike, is a fog in which missing sums and destroyed records may be concealed for years, while competing claimants, eager for any advantage, might be persuaded to pay handsomely for a solicitor's discreet assistance. You forged the marriage certificate accordingly, using paper cut from the family's own old documents, and a parish seal the Reverend Hale had once, in an unguarded hour, entrusted to your keeping during some legal business between you." "This is remarkable invention, Mr. Holmes," said Pike, in a voice of perfect composure, "though I confess I had not credited you with a talent for fiction." "You then required Hale's complicity, or at least his silence," Holmes went on, unmoved, "and secured it by threatening to expose an older fraud of his own, the false memorandum he had entered years before, for money, in the parish register. You worked upon Mrs. Mercer with hints, dropped I do not doubt with great delicacy, that Clara Vale's child might yet live, knowing she could not rest until she had shared the thought with someone, and would very likely choose young Julian for her confidence. And Julian's own debts, and his quarrel with Sir Reginald, made him the readiest scapegoat in the house, requiring only a glove and a scrap of forged paper to point suspicion where it would do you the least harm." "Conjecture, sir," said Pike, though a fine dampness had begun to show upon his brow for all the coolness of the archive. "On the night of the murder," Holmes pursued, "you had already set the archive clock some 12 minutes slow, a small alteration scarcely to be remarked, but sufficient to confuse any account of the evening's true sequence. Dr. Gresham had unwittingly given you your opportunity, having administered a sedative to Sir Reginald in his brandy. You strengthened the dose, I believe, with a further preparation of your own, and entered this room while the household's attention was engaged elsewhere, in the small confusions of that midnight hour." He paused, and stooping indicated the bolt upon the inner face of the door. "The locked room, gentlemen, upon which Inspector Bradstreet's first and most natural theory depended, was no true mystery at all, but a mechanical trick, and a simple one. A length of thin cord pressed into softened beeswax about the handle of this bolt may be drawn taut through the keyhole from without, once the door is closed, dragging the bolt home as neatly as any hand within the room could have done it. The cord is then withdrawn, leaving no trace behind but a smear of wax upon the metal, which I found, and which none but the guilty hand that left it could satisfactorily explain." Pike said nothing now, though his stillness had taken on a different character, the stillness of a man calculating rather than composing himself. "Sir Reginald, weakened though he was, seems to have roused sufficiently to resist you," Holmes continued more gravely. "In the struggle that followed, the lamp was overturned, and you arranged it afterward, together with the broken glass in the chair to suggest a fall rather than a fight. You singed the certificate at its margins, that its partial destruction might seem an old man's desperate and unsuccessful attempt to burn away his family's disgrace. Then you went out by the terrace, wearing a weighted boot beneath your own, to leave a false trail toward the chapel, and planted there a glove taken from Julian's room, and a handful of forged signatures written in your own violet ink, trusting that suspicion, once given so plain a path to follow, would not trouble to look further. And when suspicion turned, despite your efforts, upon the Reverend Hale, I could not help interjecting, you dictated his confession yourself. He is a broken man, Watson, and was made more broken still by a bottle slipped into his coat, while his wits were too clouded to resist a familiar voice telling him what he must write and where he must be found writing it. I have shown Inspector Bradstreet the blue sand from Mr. Pike's own blotting desk, ground fine into the paper of that confession, and the rectangular mark in the chapel dust where a writing board once lay, carried there only to lend the scene its proper appearance. Holmes turned now to the certificate itself, which lay upon the table where it had rested since the night of the murder. 3 facts alone would hang this forgery, without one word of confession from anybody. The parish named upon this document did not adopt adhesive-backed seals until some 14 years after the marriage it purports to record, a fact any competent archivist in London will confirm within the hour. The bride's signature shows a small and telling hesitation of the hand, precisely matching an injury Clara Vale is known, from a later letter, to have suffered to her right wrist, an injury that had not yet occurred upon the date this certificate bears, and the witness named upon it, one Samuel Price, died some 2 months before the ceremony he is supposed to have attended, as the missing page of the chapel register, folded, I believe, Inspector, inside Mr. Pike's own document case, will amply prove. It was at this last that Pike moved at last, rising with a swiftness that took even Bradstreet by surprise, and made for the passage that led toward the eastern door. But the snow, cleared though it now was from the main road, had not yet released that lesser way, and Bradstreet's sergeant, posted there upon Holmes's earlier instruction, took him without a struggle scarcely 3 yards beyond the threshold. They found upon him, when he was searched, the missing register page, a ledger of the family trusts he had thought safely destroyed, and a short length of waxed cord whose purpose none of us, after that night, had any need to ask. Chapter 10. The Road Beyond the Snow. By morning the storm had spent itself entirely, and I woke to a stillness so complete, after so many days of wind, that I lay some minutes uncertain of its cause before I understood it for silence. Sunlight, pale but unclouded, fell across the white shoulder of the moor when I came at last to the window, and below, upon the drive, I could already hear the ring of spades where a party of labourers from the village had begun to clear the road. Blackthorn Hall wore that morning the particular weariness of a house that has passed through some ordeal, and has not yet learned how to compose its features again into the shape of ordinary life. Yet there was relief there too, plain upon every face I met, the relief of people who had lived some days under a suspicion they could neither name nor escape, and who now, at last, might set it down. I found the Reverend Hale in the small morning room, released from the guard that had watched over him since the previous night, sitting with his hands folded before him in an attitude more like prayer than repose. He rose when Holmes entered, and for a moment seemed unable to find words adequate to what he owed us. "I do not know how to thank you, Mr. Holmes, for a debt I can never properly discharge." "You owe me nothing, Mr. Hale, beyond what you owe yourself," said Holmes, not unkindly. "A truth postponed does not remain quietly where it is left. It waits and grows teeth, and becomes at last a weapon in some other hand than yours. You have seen this night how very nearly it became the instrument of your own destruction." Hale bowed his head. "I have resolved to write to my bishop, and set the whole matter before him, whatever the consequence to myself. It is time, I think, that I stopped being afraid of a truth so much smaller than the one I have lately been accused of." Dr. Gresham, for his part, sought Holmes out that same morning to say, with something of his old bluntness restored, that he intended to make a full and proper record of the sedative he had administered, and to submit himself to whatever censure his professional body might see fit to impose. Julian and Mrs. Mercer, no longer under any necessity of concealment, spoke openly at last of their midnight appointment, and I thought I saw, in the quiet manner of their speaking, the beginning of an understanding between them that owed nothing to the fear which had first thrown them together. It remained only to settle the question that had brought us to Blackthorn Hall in the first place. Further inquiry among the family's older papers, together with a letter Holmes caused to be sent to a former parish clerk now living in retirement near Harrogate, established beyond doubt that Clara Vale had never in fact married Captain Ashcombe. Her reference in the old letter Reed had brought us to the truth of the marriage concerned not herself, it transpired, but another and humbler couple of the parish, whose union Hale had years before improperly and carelessly recorded in a small dishonesty that Pike, with his solicitor's eye for old irregularities, had seized upon and turned to so much darker a purpose. Eleanor Ashcombe remained, as she had always been believed, the lawful heir to Blackthorn Hall. But I was not surprised, knowing something of her character even from our brief acquaintance, to learn before we left that she had already set in motion inquiries to discover whether any true descendant of Clara Vale yet lived, with a view to making some provision for them, not from any obligation the law might recognise, but from a simple conviction that a family's fortune ought not to rest easy upon another's unrighted sorrow. Sir Reginald Ashcombe was buried, once the roads permitted it, in the small chapel where so much of the mystery surrounding his death had lately unfolded, and I confess I found some quiet fitness in that, though I could not have said precisely why. We took our leave of Blackthorn Hall upon the afternoon following, the carriage wheels cutting fresh black lines through snow already softening under a reluctant sun. For a good while neither of us spoke, and I busied myself with my own reflections upon all we had witnessed. "It is a strange thing, Holmes," I said at last, as the grey towers of the hall dropped away behind the shoulder of a hill, "that nearly every soul in that house had lied to us in some particular, and yet only one among them proved a murderer. I confess I do not know how you kept the true thread among so many false ones." "Deception is not detected by counting false statements, Watson," said Holmes, watching the white fields slide past the window. "A man may tell 100 lies in an hour and be guilty of nothing worse than vanity or fear. The test is never how many falsehoods a man utters, but whether his account, examined coldly and without sentiment, could actually have occurred as he describes it. Hale's confession failed that test the moment he named a clock that could not have struck. Pike's account failed it in a dozen small particulars that only patience and a certain distrust of convenient explanations could uncover. And if you had trusted the obvious answer, the bolted door, the burnt certificate, the glove in the snow, then an innocent, foolish, frightened clergyman would very possibly have hanged for another man's crime," said Holmes gravely, "and a solicitor of considerable ability would have continued at his leisure to loot the fortunes of families who had trusted him with their most private affairs. I have long believed, Watson, that the most dangerous moment in any inquiry is not when the facts are scarce, but when they are suddenly and suspiciously abundant. Coincidence, fear, and the outward appearance of respectability had very nearly overwhelmed reason in that house. The truth survived, in the end, not because I asked which story sounded most convincing to the ear, but because I asked, again and again, which story could actually have happened in the world as it is, and not merely as frightened men wished it to be. I said nothing further, but sat watching the moor unroll its white and silent miles, beneath a sky at last swept clear, and reflected, not for the first time, upon the singular clarity of mind that could find, amid so much grief and so much falsehood, the one thread that led, unbroken, to the truth.